A girl's scream echoes through the stone corridors of Bletsoe Castle on a winter night in 1457 AD. The sound cuts through the howling wind like a blade through silk. In a chamber lit only by flickering candles, 13-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort grips the bloodied sheets beneath her, her small body convulsing with pain that no child should ever endure. The midwives whisper prayers in Latin, their faces grave in the dancing shadows. Outside, snow falls on the frozen ground of Bedfordshire, but inside this room, a future King of England is being torn from a girl barely past childhood herself. Margaret's auburn hair clings to her sweat-drenched face as another wave of agony crashes over her. She is dying, they think. The baby is too large, her hips too narrow. At 13, her body has not finished growing, yet here she labours to bring forth the son who will one day sit upon the throne of England as Henry VII. The irony is lost on no one present. This child, born of such suffering, will end the bloodiest conflict in English history and found the Tudor dynasty that will reshape the world. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The girl writhing in that bed was no ordinary noble maiden. Lady Margaret Beaufort carried within her veins the blood of kings, specifically the blood of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, fourth son of Edward III. But royal blood, as Margaret would learn throughout her extraordinary life, could be both blessing and curse. In the savage political landscape of 15th century England, where the Wars of the Roses would soon tear the realm apart, such bloodlines made you either a valuable pawn or a dangerous threat. Margaret's path to that birthing chamber began years earlier, when she was still a child playing in the gardens of Bletsoe Castle. Born around May 1443 AD to John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, she entered a world where alliances shifted like sand and marriage was the ultimate weapon of statecraft. Her father died when she was barely a year old, some say by his own hand after military defeats in France left him broken and disgraced. Others whispered of poison, for in those days whispers of poison followed every unexpected death of the nobility, like vultures following an army. The circumstances of John Beaufort's death haunted Margaret's early years. He had commanded English forces in France during the final phases of the 100 Years' War, watching helplessly as territory won by Henry V slipped away piece by piece. The military disasters ate at him like a cancer. When he returned to England in 1444 AD, courtiers noted his hollow eyes and trembling hands. He spoke little, ate less, and spent hours staring at nothing. On May 27, 1444 AD, he was found dead in his chambers at Wimborne Minster. The official cause was fever, but those closest to him knew better. Whether by blade, poison, or simply the weight of failure, John Beaufort had chosen death over dishonour. Margaret's mother wasted no time in securing her daughter's future. The Dowager Duchess Margaret Beauchamp understood the rules of survival in a world where women and children were only as valuable as the alliances they could cement. By the age of 6, little Margaret was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. The contract bound two of England's most powerful families in an alliance that seemed unbreakable. But politics moved faster than childhood, and when Suffolk fell from grace and was murdered while crossing the English Channel in 1450 AD, that betrothal became worthless paper. Suffolk's crime had been negotiating the marriage of Henry VI to Margaret of Anjou and the surrender of Maine and Anjou to France, terms that enraged the English nobility and common people alike. His death was brutal even by the standards of the time. Dragged from his ship by pirates or political enemies, he was forced to kneel on the gunwale while one of his captors struck off his head with a rusty sword, requiring half a dozen clumsy blows. The Beaufort women learned early that survival meant adaptability. Her next betrothal came swiftly, to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI through his mother's marriage to Owen Tudor. The Tudors were Welsh upstarts with questionable legitimacy, but they had one thing that mattered more than ancient bloodlines: the king's favour. Owen Tudor had been a court official who caught the eye of Catherine of Valois, Henry V's widow. Their secret marriage had scandalised the nobility, but produced two sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, whom Henry VI recognised and elevated to the peerage. In 1455 AD, when Margaret was approximately 12 years old, she was married to Edmund Tudor in a ceremony that sealed political alliances with words of love she barely understood and vows that would bind her to a destiny beyond imagining. The wedding took place at Bletsoe Castle, the same stronghold where Margaret had spent her childhood. The great hall was decorated with tapestries depicting the deeds of her Beaufort ancestors, while the chapel where they exchanged vows contained the tomb of her grandfather John Beaufort, Earl of Somerset. Edmund Tudor was a man in his 20s, seasoned by war and politics. Margaret was still growing out of her childhood clothes. The marriage was consummated immediately. There was no concept of waiting for physical maturity, in an age when noble girls were treated as broodmares for dynastic ambitions. The wedding night was a trauma that Margaret never spoke of in later life, but the evidence of its impact would be written in her body's permanent damage and her lifelong religious devotion that bordered on obsession. Within months of her wedding, Margaret's body began changing in ways that terrified her young mind. The older women around her spoke in hushed tones about her condition, their faces mixing joy for a potential heir with concern for such a young mother. Margaret's own mother watched her daughter's growing belly with deep anxiety. She had been 18 when Margaret was born, old enough to survive childbirth safely. At 12, soon to be 13, Margaret was attempting something that had killed countless women older and stronger than herself. But Edmund Tudor would never see his child born. In the autumn of 1456 AD, while campaigning in Wales against Yorkist forces, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. The circumstances of his capture and subsequent death remain murky, wrapped in the fog of civil war and political intrigue. Some accounts suggest he was taken during a surprise attack while his forces were scattered across South Wales. Others hint at betrayal from within his own ranks. Whether he died of plague in his prison or was murdered by his captors remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. The plague explanation was convenient for his captors. Disease was common in medieval prisons, and claiming natural death avoided charges of murdering a royal half-brother. But contemporary chroniclers noted the suspicious speed of his decline and the refusal of his captors to allow physicians to attend him. What we know is that by November 1456 AD, 13-year-old Margaret was a widow, pregnant, and utterly alone in a world that was about to explode into civil war. The news of Edmund's death reached Margaret at Lamphay Palace in Pembrokeshire, where she had been staying while her husband campaigned. The messenger arrived on a rain-soaked November evening, his horse lathered with sweat from the desperate ride across Wales. Margaret was in the palace chapel, praying for her husband's safe return, when the messenger's boots echoed on the stone floor behind her. She knew before he spoke that her world had shattered. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, took responsibility for his pregnant sister-in-law. The decision was both chivalrous and practical. Margaret carried the potential heir to the Tudor line, the child who might continue their family's royal connection. He brought her to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle in Wales, where the massive stone walls offered protection from the growing chaos outside. Pembroke was a fortress on the edge of the world, perched on cliffs above Milford Haven, where the Atlantic waves crashed endlessly against the rocks below. Here, in this remote Welsh castle, Margaret would endure the most harrowing experience of her young life. The journey to Pembroke in her advanced pregnancy was an ordeal in itself. Winter roads were barely passable, rutted with frozen mud and blocked by fallen trees. Margaret travelled in a horse-drawn litter, each jolt and bump sending pain through her swollen body. The journey that should have taken 2 days stretched to 5 as they navigated around flooded rivers and avoided bands of armed men whose loyalties were unknown. Pembroke Castle in winter was a harsh refuge. Built on a limestone outcrop above the Pembroke River, the castle dominated the landscape for miles around. Its great round keep, nearly 80 feet high, had withstood sieges and storms for 3 centuries. But comfort was not its purpose. Survival was. The castle's chambers were cold and draughty, warmed only by great fireplaces that devoured wood faster than servants could supply it. Margaret's rooms were hung with thick tapestries to block the wind that whistled through every crack in the ancient stones. The winter of 1456 to 1457 AD was particularly brutal. Ice formed on the inside of the castle windows, and the sea wind howled through every crack in the ancient stones. Margaret, her belly swollen with child, could barely walk the length of her chamber without exhausting herself. Her body, still that of a child in many ways, struggled under the burden it carried. The castle's physician, a learned man who had studied at the universities of Oxford and Paris, examined her with growing alarm. Her hips were too narrow, he confided to Jasper Tudor. The child was positioned badly. Birth would be dangerous, perhaps fatal. Dr. Lewis Carleon was a man who had delivered children to queens and peasants alike. He had studied the ancient texts of Hippocrates and Galen, attended lectures by the greatest medical minds of his generation, and accumulated 40 years of experience in the healing arts. But as he examined the pregnant child in his care, all his learning seemed inadequate. Margaret's pelvis had not fully developed. She was still growing herself. The baby within her womb was large, positioned wrong, and showed signs of distress. He confided his fears to Jasper Tudor during a private meeting in the castle's solar. Snow swirled outside the arrow-slit windows as the two men discussed Margaret's fate in whispers. Caerleon was blunt. He had seen this situation before, and it rarely ended well for mother or child. They could attempt to turn the baby, but that might kill both patients immediately. They could try to wait, hoping nature would correct the position, but delay increased the risk of the child's death and Margaret's exhaustion, or they could attempt a caesarean birth, a procedure that was almost invariably fatal to the mother. Jasper Tudor, barely 25 himself, faced the terrible burden of deciding his sister-in-law's fate. If Margaret died, the Tudor line would end with him, a younger son with no legitimate heirs of his own. If she lived but lost the child, the same result would follow. The political implications weighed heavily, but so did personal affection. He had grown fond of the brave, intelligent girl who had faced widowhood with such dignity. As Margaret's pregnancy progressed through the dark winter months, she displayed a maturity that belied her years. She spent her time learning everything she could about politics and statecraft, understanding instinctively that knowledge would be her greatest weapon in the struggles ahead. Jasper Tudor, impressed by her intelligence and determination, became her tutor in the arts of survival. He taught her to read people's faces, to hear the unspoken messages behind diplomatic language, to understand the complex web of alliances and enmities that governed noble society. Margaret also threw herself into religious study with an intensity that worried her attendants. She spent hours in the castle chapel, praying before the altar until her knees were raw and bleeding. She memorized Latin prayers, studied theological texts, and developed the deep personal relationship with God that would sustain her through decades of political struggle. Some historians suggest that her extreme religiosity began as a coping mechanism for the trauma of child marriage and impending motherhood, a way to impose meaning on suffering that otherwise seemed senseless. The castle's priest, Father Meredith, became another important figure in Margaret's education, a Welshman who had been educated at Cambridge before taking holy orders. He understood both the classical learning of the universities and the practical politics of survival in a violent world. He taught Margaret that God often worked through human agency, that prayer without action was empty, but action guided by prayer could move mountains. On that January night in 1457 AD, Margaret's labour began with pains that doubled her over. She had been walking the castle battlements, taking the exercise that Dr. Caerleon insisted was necessary for her health, when the first contractions struck. The pain was unlike anything she had experienced, a crushing, tearing sensation that seemed to split her body in half. She collapsed against the stone ramparts, gasping, while her attending ladies rushed to help her back to her chambers. The midwives, experienced women who had delivered countless babies, exchanged glances heavy with meaning. They had seen this before, a child trying to give birth to a child, nature pushed beyond its limits by human ambition and political necessity. They prepared their instruments and said their prayers, knowing that before dawn one or both of their patients might be dead. Dame Gwenllian Furch Stafford, the head midwife, was a woman who had been delivering babies for 30 years. She had learned her craft from her own mother and grandmother, inheriting secrets passed down through generations of Welsh women. She knew herbs that could ease pain, techniques for turning breech babies, and prayers that seemed to give strength to labouring mothers. But as she examined Margaret, her weathered face grew grave. The other midwives prepared their instruments with grim efficiency. There were knives for cutting the birth cord, but also for procedures too horrible to contemplate. There were hooks and forceps for extracting dead children, potions to strengthen weak mothers, and holy relics to call upon divine intervention. The chamber filled with the smoke of burning herbs, lavender for calming, rosemary for strength, and other plants whose properties were known only to the women who tended births and deaths. For 18 hours Margaret laboured in agony that defied description. Her screams echoed off the stone walls until her voice gave out entirely, leaving only gasping animal sounds of suffering. The midwives worked frantically, their hands slick with blood as they tried to save both mother and child. Dame Gwenllian used every technique in her considerable arsenal: massage, positioning changes, herbal remedies, and constant encouragement whispered in Margaret's ear. Jasper Tudor paced the corridors outside, his boots clicking against the stone flags, knowing that the future of the Lancastrian cause might die in that chamber. He could hear Margaret's screams through the heavy oak door, each one cutting through him like a blade. Servants hurried past with basins of hot water and armloads of clean linen, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. Father Meredith knelt in the chapel, praying without ceasing for the young woman whose life hung by the thinnest of threads. As dawn approached, Margaret's strength began to fail. She had been in labour for nearly a full day, her young body pushed far beyond its limits. Dr. Carlian, summoned from his uneasy sleep, examined her and spoke in urgent whispers with Dame Gwenllian. The baby was alive but in distress, its heartbeat irregular and weak. Margaret was bleeding internally, her pulse thready and her skin pale as parchment. The decision was made to attempt manual extraction, a dangerous procedure that might save the child at the cost of the mother's life. Dame Gwenllian had performed the technique before, but never on someone so young and small. She positioned Margaret carefully, praying silently to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of childbirth, as she prepared to reach inside the young woman's body and guide the baby into the world. When the baby finally emerged, torn from Margaret's body in a process that nearly killed her, the midwives held their breath. The infant was pale, barely breathing, covered in blood and birthing fluid. For a terrifying moment, the chamber was silent except for Margaret's laboured breathing and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Then Dame Gwenllian cleared the baby's mouth and throat, and the sound that changed everything filled the air, a thin, angry wail that announced the arrival of Henry Tudor, future King of England. Margaret, barely conscious, her young body shattered by the ordeal, heard her son's first cry through a haze of pain and exhaustion. She tried to reach for him, but her arms would not obey her mind's commands. Dame Gwenllian placed the baby on Margaret's chest for a brief moment, the traditional first meeting between mother and child, before rushing him to the fire to be cleaned and swaddled. Margaret's eyes followed the infant with desperate intensity, memorizing every detail of his tiny face. The damage to Margaret's body was severe and permanent. Dr. Carlian, examining her in the days following the birth, found extensive tearing and internal injuries that would never fully heal. The physician spoke in whispers of torn flesh and damaged organs, of blood loss that had nearly proved fatal. She would never bear another child. This single traumatic birth had ended her childbearing years before they had properly begun. At 13, she was effectively barren, her reproductive life sacrificed on the altar of dynastic politics. The physical recovery was agonizingly slow. For weeks Margaret hovered between life and death, racked by fever and infection. Dr. Carlian applied every remedy in his considerable arsenal, bloodletting to balance her humours, herbal poultices to fight infection, and strong wines fortified with medicinal herbs to restore her strength. Dame Gwenllian never left her side, spooning broth between Margaret's cracked lips and monitoring every change in her condition. Margaret's psychological recovery proved even more complex. The trauma of her experience manifested in nightmares that left her screaming and crying in the small hours of the night. She developed an intense fear of physical contact, flinching away from even the gentlest touch of her attendants. Her relationship with her newborn son became complicated by the association between his presence and her pain. She loved him desperately, but could barely tolerate holding him without being overwhelmed by memories of his violent birth. But if Margaret Beaufort's body was broken, her spirit remained unshattered. As she recovered slowly in the months following Henry's birth, she began to display the iron will and calculating intelligence that would make her one of the most powerful women in English history. She understood, even in her weakened state, that her son represented the future of the Lancastrian cause. She also understood that a landless widow with a baby son needed protection in a world sliding toward chaos. The Wars of the Roses were erupting around them with increasing violence. In 1455 AD, the First Battle of St. Albans had announced that England would settle its dynastic disputes with sword and axe rather than negotiation. The White Rose of York faced the Red Rose of Lancaster in a conflict that would consume the nobility of England for 3 decades. Richard, Duke of York, claimed the throne based on his descent from Edward III's second son, while the Lancastrians held it through their descent from Edward III's fourth son, John of Gaunt. Margaret, holder of Lancastrian blood through her Beaufort lineage, was now automatically aligned with a cause that was losing ground rapidly. The Lancastrian king, Henry VI, was widely regarded as weak, possibly insane, and certainly incapable of effective rule. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was more capable but also more hated, a foreign woman who was blamed for England's military disasters in France and the kingdom's slide towards civil war. Her solution was marriage. Again, in 1458 AD, barely recovered from Henry's birth, she married Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. The wedding was a quiet affair, nothing like the pageantry that had accompanied her marriage to Edmund Tudor. Margaret was still weak, still grieving, and her new husband was a stranger chosen for